Today is Father's Day 2020. I was very blessed to have an awesome father. He was a godly man who took his faith very seriously, but he also worked very hard at having fun and enjoying life. My dad was a real family man and went out of his way to make life enjoyable for his family and all the other people around him. As a young man, my brothers and I, and sometimes my sisters, were always helping our father with work. And I would say that in our home, we had very definite rules. My father never ever cooked, and my mother never ever was out in the hayfield making hay with us or helping us cut wood for our wood supply for the winter. But we all worked together and we played together too. Many times we would work extra hours so that we could get the work done early, like hauling the hay into the barn or something like that, so that we would have time later in that day to either go on a hike or go fishing or play ball or something like that. I didn't get to know either of my grandfathers as an adult because they both died before I was a teenager, but neither my Grandpa Kaufman nor my Grandpa Unternair really had the same zest for life or enjoyed life the way my father did. Now, yes, my grandfather Kaufman, or my dad's dad, was over 40 years old when my father was born, and my grandpa, my mother's father, my Grandpa Unternair, was in that same age bracket, but they didn't have the same zest for enjoying life. But my dad was doing recreational activities, playing sports, and that kind of thing in his 60s and 70s. And my father actually played basketball in recreational leagues until he was 64 years old. And even when he was in his 70s, he was still hiking around the mountains and going hunting for deer and elk in Montana. Today, the Bible story is all about fatherhood and some of the stresses that come with fatherhood. Today, the text comes from Genesis 21, and it has all the mystery, all the angst, and all the conflicts that every great story has in it. Also, to be totally candid, there are parts of this story that make me cringe. There are parts of this story that make me want to shout out, "Wait a minute! Father Abraham did what?" As we view this story from our 21st century mindset, parts of this story just they make us shudder and shake because from a historical perspective, we know that in their culture, slavery and ownership of slaves was perfectly acceptable. And yet for us today, slavery and owner of slaves is absolutely not acceptable. It is a violation of human rights because God created all of us and loves each and every one of us equally. Today, we're still caught in this COVID-19 pandemic, and so our current situation of dealing with all the changed parts of life that come with this pandemic causes us to view it through a different lens, or you would say it flavors or colors every aspect of life around us. So for the last 4 months, we've been having to deal with this life of the pandemic. And as we look at human natures, this pandemic has brought out the best in people, and it has also brought out the worst in people. For many healthcare workers, we see the very best being brought out. Many of these healthcare workers have worked insane amounts of hours just to provide loving care for people. We have also seen many scams from people trying to take advantage of the pandemic situation. And I think today's stories and the stresses within today's stories also cause some of the characters to bring out the best in them and also some of the worst in them. So today, on Father's Day, the Holy Scriptures have to do with the father of the Israelite people, Father Abraham. So here's a little background on today's stories and today's Bible passage. We know that from past studies that God called Abram, who was later named Abraham, and said he would be the father of a great nation in Genesis 12. We also know that Abraham wasn't perfect because at the end of chapter 12, Abraham tells a blatant lie to Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, just to save his own skin. He told Pharaoh that Sarai, who was later named Sarah, who was an extremely beautiful lady, was his sister, and as was the custom in that culture, so Pharaoh added her to his harem, or Pharaoh made her one of his wives. We also know that Abraham wasn't totally perfect in that he was not trusting of God to follow through on what God had promised. Because when God said he would make him a great nation, and this wasn't happening fast enough, then in chapter 16, Sarah says to Abraham, God hasn't allowed me to have any children, so here, take my Egyptian slave girl Hagar as your wife so you can have a family with her. And so Abraham followed up on Sarah's advice and took Hagar as his wife, and right away they have a son, and they named him Ishmael. But even though it was Sarah's idea to have Hagar be Abraham's wife, things did not go well. And as I said earlier, today's text is from Genesis 21, and it deals with the story of how Hagar and her child Ishmael are chased out of the household of Abraham. At first, when you look at this text, I thought, man, what a terrible text for Father's Day. And yet, as I studied it and as I lived with it and I read it over and over and over, I saw there are things that we can very much learn from this Bible story. One of the things that we do every night here at the Kaufman household is that I read Bible stories to Lucy. Stories come from Lucy's Bible, and not only does she love these stories, she loves to have them read over and over and over to her, but I think it is also very, very important to have these Bible stories etched in the memory of each young child, because I believe that it permanently affects the way they see life and the decisions that they make in their lives. This is not one of the stories that's included in Lucy's children's Bible, but I believe that we can learn from it today. Many Bible scholars believe that this text, Genesis 21, 8-21, is a parallel story to Genesis 16, verses 6-16. Bible scholars have traditionally viewed these as two different accounts of the same story, but coming from two different sources. So it would be like two different parts of the family having the same part of family history, but telling it from two different perspectives. The same story, but from two different angles. So the first story in Genesis 16 would come from people who call God Yahweh, and the writings come from about the 10th century BCE. The second text, or today's text from Genesis 21, come from the group of people who would call God Elohim, and come from the writings about 100 years later, or the 9th century BCE. Neither of the sources is right or wrong. Neither of the accounts is right or wrong. They just see different perspectives of the same story. It would be like two different parts of the same family. It'd be like one part of the family calls their grandfather Papa. Another part of the family would call their grandfather Grandpa. Well, they're talking about the same person. They have a relationship with the same people. It's just that they come from two different perspectives. In this case, one group calls God Yahweh. The other group calls God Elohim. The same God is being worshiped. They're just using different names. Today's text immediately follows the account of the birth of Isaac in Genesis 21, 1-7. And it is the fulfillment of God's promise of a son to be born to the previously childless Sarah and Abraham in Genesis. The story is told in Genesis 17 and 18. Now, it is super interesting to me that when Isaac, the miracle child, is born, the parents, who were by many standards way too old to have children, that they named him Isaac, whose name literally means of laughter, or he laughs, because there was great joy when this child came into their lives. But in today's text, laughter is what causes the trouble. Historically, these cultures had a very high infant mortality rate compared to today's standards. And one commentary that I read said they thought as high as 1/3 of the children born to these people did not survive even the first year of life. We don't know if that's exactly true, but we do know that in verse 8, Abraham throws a grand celebration when the child Isaac is weaned. Most scholars would think that Isaac would have been about age 3 at this time. And so Abraham throws this great feast. But at the feast, Sarah sees something that she doesn't like. In fact, she sees Ishmael laughing with Isaac, and it doesn't sit well with her. Now, the Bible doesn't use this exact verbiage in verse 9, but when Sarah saw Ishmael playing with or laughing at young Isaac, she threw a hissy fit. She threw a temper tantrum and demanded that Abraham, quote unquote, get rid of that slave woman and her son, even though she was the one who suggested that they be married. Sarah doesn't want her son Isaac to have to share in the inheritance with the son Ishmael. Now, it is interesting also to me that had they been born later in Jewish culture, that Ishmael, being the oldest son, would have gotten twice as much of the inheritance as his younger brother Isaac would have received. Again, we don't know exactly what Sarah saw. The New Revised Standard Version of the Bible translates the passage this way. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar playing with her son Isaac. But other translations, like the King James Version, American Standard, the Holman Christian Standard, and others, have gone in a different direction. They say, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar laughing at, mocking, or making sport of her son Isaac. But whatever Sarah saw caused her to get as mad as a hornet, and she flew off the handle and demanded that Ishmael and Hagar be chased away from Abraham's household. Now, as we read this, we can imagine how it made Abraham feel. This is Abraham's firstborn son who she was talking about. This would be the exact time when Abraham should sit up and shout, "Hey, wait a minute." But as we continue, we read in verse 11 that obviously Sarah's demands to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael are causing Abraham some serious pain. But when Abraham is reassured by God that Ishmael's descendants, like Isaac's descendants, will be a great nation, Abraham follows through on Sarah's request and chases Hagar and Ishmael away from the household. Now, I understand that God has chosen the biological family line of Abraham and Isaac to send a Savior in Jesus, but this is a part of the story that seems extremely harsh to me. It's almost like Abraham is giving his wife Hagar and her son Ishmael a death sentence. Typically, there would have been no way that a woman and her young teenage son could have survived in that desert situation by themselves without a clan to support them. And only by divine miraculous intervention could Ishmael and his mother Hagar be saved from death. This is both a very painful part of the story, but it is also a very exciting part of the story where we see God's divine intervention and God bringing salvation to both Hagar and Ishmael. The text tells us in verse 16 that after the water they had taken with them was gone, life looked terrible, and the chance of survival appeared to be very, very slim. So while Ishmael is under the bush, maybe hiding there for relief from the sun or whatever, that his mother Hagar went a little ways away because she couldn't stand to see her son starve to death or die from dehydration. But is it exactly at that time that God sends an angel to care for them? The angel reassures Hagar that Ishmael will survive, and as promised by God to Abraham, that her family, through her son Ishmael, will become a great nation. Also note, just a little side note, a point of interest here is that Hagar is the only woman in the biblical text who is specifically promised that her biological descendants or her family will become a great nation. We also see in verse 19 that Hagar's eyes are divinely opened so that she discovers a nearby water well. She sees a source of water close by her. And it is amazingly similar to, in fact, almost exactly like Abraham's experience of discovering the ram with his horns caught in the thicket to use as an offering in place of his son Isaac in Genesis 22, verse 13. This is an amazing story of salvation and deliverance. In the situation that looked totally impossible, it looked like certain death for Hagar and Ishmael, God shows up with amazing salvation. In verse 20, this chapter of the story of this miraculous deliverance from death ends with the statement, God was with Ishmael. It is exactly the same statement that we hear in Genesis 39, verse 2, after Joseph has been sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt. Also in verse 20, there is the news that Ishmael grew up while he was living in the desert and then became a great archer and hunter. We also find out that Hagar gets a wife for Ishmael in Egypt. Very typically, this would have been a job for a man to get a wife for his son, but in this case, Hagar, his mother, fulfills the role. So what can we learn from this story today, this Father's Day 2020? I think that there are actually three different things, specific points that we can learn from this story. First of all, it would be reiterated from last week or repeated from last week that God is 100% faithful. God is always faithful. God was faithful to Noah. God was faithful to Abraham. God was faithful to Hagar. And God was faithful to Ishmael and Isaac, the sons of Abraham. If God promises something, it will absolutely happen. The second thing that we see is that even when we are mistreated and abused by others, God is still with us and God will provide for us. No matter what kind of trauma happens to us, we are still very much a part of God's creation and loved by God. In this story, Hagar and Ishmael were grossly mistreated by Sarah and Abraham. And yet we also see that God was with them and provided salvation for them. It is a story very, very similar to the storyline of Joseph being mistreated and abused by his brothers and sold into slavery. And yet we know God was with Joseph as he was also with Ishmael and provided salvation for both of them. God has promised he will never leave us or forsake us. And the third and final thing that I believe we can see from this is that God uses imperfect people to carry out his story. So here we are on Father's Day 2020, literally thousands of years after the event where Abraham was not acting like a good father. Think about how crazy this would be for a father to send out his wife and son into the desert to die. Abraham was not being a good father to Ishmael, and yet here's the great mystery. God uses Abraham to become the father of the Israelite nation. So here on Father's Day 2020, this is the good news. This is the word of hope for today. If you have been mistreated by your father or your family, there is hope because, like Ishmael and Joseph, always remember that God is with you. And if you have not been a good father like Abraham and have made some terrible decisions that have caused others a lot of pain, there is hope for you. If God used an imperfect Abraham, God can use each one of us. Today is a day of celebrating our fathers and acknowledging the love of, I would say, the unfailing love of God, our Heavenly Father. May God richly bless each of you today.